Starting. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, and welcome to day 2 of the virtual international conference organized by Inspirare Arts Foundation and in collaboration with Himachal Pradesh University and Alliance Française du Bengal. I am very happy and very privileged, actually, to start this session today, which is titled French Orientalist Interventions and Modern India. To discuss these issues with me today is Dr. Kanchana Mukhopadhyay, who has joined me from Kolkata. We will, for the next 1 hour, try and unravel these issues for you as best as we can. Welcome, Kanchanadi, to the virtual international conference. And I begin by thanking Alliance Française and you personally for supporting this venture, this ferment of ideas that we are trying to hold here in these difficult times. I will introduce Kanchanadi formally for our participants and listeners today. Dr. Kanchana Mukhopadhyay is the second-time president of Alliance Française du Bengal. She is the founder member of InTouch Conservation Center, Kolkata, and co-convener of Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. She is a scholar of French and Indian history and author of a very seminal text, Chandannagar and its Dependencies, 1674 to 1731, a reference book of French history in Bengal. She is a translator of contemporary French literature into Bangla. She has published 6 works. She has translated Tahar Ben Jaloun, André Voltaire, and Clésio. She's a seminarist on history and heritage in France, Turkey, Sri Lanka, and India. She received the insignia of Chevalier d'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres from Cultural Ministry of France in 2014. A distinguished historian and a cultural activist, if I may put it that way, and a cultural enthusiast. I once again welcome Kanchanadi to this event, to our session today. In 2017, when the French government started this initiative of cultural diplomacy called Bonjour India, it was to tell the story of how and where we met, meaning how France and India met. The meeting of France and India has always been a slightly troubled tale, as Kanchanadi would attest to it. The thin veneer of culture can't mask the anxiety. Like the British, the French were importing Indian products. India was one of those rich sources of exotic products like muslin. And then, of course, Tipu Sultan's emissaries or ambassadors arriving in France in about 1788, creating a huge stir, with their regalia and all that. And I remember, my history is a little hazy, but I still remember the fact that during the French Revolution, those French mercenaries who were stationed in Tipu's court actually started hailing him as a citizen emperor, a citizen sultan, of course, with the influence of the French Revolution. And who can forget, of course, Jules Verne's 1870 adventure, of course, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Captain Nemo is this exiled Indian prince who has fought the British in the mutiny of 1857, but finds nowhere, hospitable space in the world, so he has gone undersea. So that's a statement of the raw aggression of British colonial power, and also of the French take on it, perhaps, that someone has to escape the world and go undersea to find some refuge somewhere in his nautilus. And of course, there have been other French preoccupations, latter day, spiritual, others who thought that, I think if I'm not mistaken, Maximilian Portas, yes, the mathematician who thought that Hitler was an avatar of Vishnu, of all people. So the obsession has lingered. I would start today's conversation with Kanchanadi with the idea that the word Orientalist for the French has always been a slightly pejorative term, whereas the British, have always treated it with more respect, a specialist, an area specialist, and all that. Why this slightly pejorative association of the word in French, and how much has French culture and history impacted on this particular take on the word? Kanchanadi, if you could elaborate on that for a start.
Thank you, Debashish. First of all, I want to thank you for a very flamboyant introduction of mine. Um, and so let us come to the main topic. Number one, I wanted to tell you that the Bonjour India program started as early as 2010-11. The first time there was a delegation of 6 to 8 writers who traveled in different cities of India, and many of them, I was surprised to find that many of them were already quite inquisitive about Indian culture. And one particular poet of whom you have referred, Andre Velter, he has traveled a lot and he has written many poems on India. So those were the people who were interested in India, and so that was the first Bonjour India, and then we had a second and third. And for pandemic, we couldn't have any more. After 2017, you are very right. And we are also planning to have another one in 2022 if everything goes all right. So that is number one. And number two, coming back to your question, uh, the connotation of Orientalism, the connotation of Indology are changed nowadays. At the beginning, as you have very rightly said, that when in England, people used to talk about Orientalism, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Byron, Pope. All of them designated the East geographically, morally, and culturally. Often in Europe, people talk about Oriental personality, Oriental tales, Oriental despotism, and for them, actually, Orient is not a geographical identity as Occident, because both are man-made, But as Edward Said has said, Orient is an idea that has historically and that has a history and tradition of thought, Oriental thought. And according to Said, after Napoleon, the Orient became a place of pilgrimage. For the English nation, Orient was basically India. Orient was India centric, and the maximum limit was near Orient, or that was the way to pass en route to a major colony. But for the French, it was a place of pilgrimage to a place in which France has lost its right of sovereign presence. Hence, the Mission Civilisatrice, as they call it, the civilization mission, began from 19th century after Napoleon. And same is applicable for Indology also, because the recent debate which is going on about Indology, propagated by historians like Romila Thapar, they don't like the term Indology from the point of history, if you say so. From the point of history, that is to say, in Indology there are epics, there are Puranas, which are not exactly the part of history. So they call it ancient Indian history very specifically. But at the same time, I would tell you that we really can't make a watertight compartment between Indology and ancient Indian history, because how can you depict ancient or even today's history, today's current affairs without Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas? It is not possible. So it is a interdisciplinary thing, I think. And as you have already told us, that the Britishers, they have done from a point of view a little bit apology as if it is an apology. But at the same time, I'll tell you, it was for them, Oriental, when they say Orientalism, it was from the point of view of superiority. In my opinion, it was from the point of view of superiority. In 19th century, the Orient was the Orient of memories, the Orient of forgotten secrets, and hidden correspondences. In France, you will find this effect in Narval's writing, in Baudelaire's writing, in Flaubert's writing, but its seeds were sown much earlier. In fact, I find in that sense it was not called Indology or Orientalism, but I find the resources which the initial French visitors have left can always be treated as the main source material of Indology. So, from that point of view, the point of view differs. Unmute yourself, Devashish.
So it's very interesting that you mention Gerard Nerval and Flaubert, and the experience of. I think you talked about the reluctance on the part of France to be really involved with the Orient. There's a certain reluctance, and therefore perhaps But I think colonialism forced the French hands, because when France wanted to come to India, I mean, in the sense that around the late 17th century, when 1664, I think Pondicherry was in 1664, it was set up. So the thing is, of course, after the Portuguese and after the British, so they were latecomers in a way, into Indian history and into. But colonialism, I think, forced their hand, in especially even with Orientalism. They had to now get into India, in a way. And do you, at any point, feel in your studies, in your experience, in your dealings with this area, that the failed French state, or the failure of the French state, sorry, to build an empire in the East, in India, the subcontinent, allowed French intellectuals to create a surrogate empire through their scholarship, through their imagination? Is that a tenable thesis that we can use?
Actually, this is a theory more nearer to my heart also, because I think, as you know, the other side of the river is always green. As we were colonized by the Britishers, we always thought that other people were much generous, much noble. But this is exactly what I also think, as depicted by uh, essayist called uh, Frank Halst. Frank Halst, in a very old issue of Bengal Past and Present, I'm quoting his lines because I liked it very much. The characteristic of French approach brought defeat and produced the possibility of their sensitivity to India, finding the expression. I think this is very right, because if you make a comparison with the French colonialism or Portuguese colonialism, uh, perhaps the scenario will be different in their own countries, in those countries which were really colonized. And for us, I find that your theory is very right, that they tried to not, I shouldn't say tried to create a surrogate empire, but I should say their inquisitiveness was much more profound, without any political interest, without any interest of sovereignty, any interest of political ambition. That is my idea too.
Kanchanadi, I mean, we kind of can christen this subject also as a kind of a study of comparative colonialisms. The failed French example and the more successful British one. but
Yeah.
French colonialism was much more successful outside India, as we all know.
Outside India.
Now,
Yeah.
would you then, under the circumstances, consider the French voices, historical and Orientalist voices, as peripheral voices? And would you consider that you just mentioned the more politically isolated the French became, the more politically defeated they were, the more larger than life became the impact upon culture, the impact of India upon French culture, French writing. It's very interesting. It's inversely proportional almost. The more the involvement of the French became minuscule in India, the more the involvement of cultural theorists, writers, historians, Orientalists became more strong in India. It's very interesting. I mean, the British story is a very different story. They were actually there to plumb India. There was a political agenda to it all. And you just mentioned the French example is much more free of that agenda, but somehow affected by it. The more you had to vacate India physically, you could not
Hmm.
claim India to be your own. The more involved you became with India as an idea, India as its cultural body, you became more involved with it. Would you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right because when you have a political ambition, uh, when you have a political ambition, the idea of aggression comes with it, and the people, those who are really involved in that field, hardly bother about the cultural discovery of that country. Of course, there are many people, those who have a different point of view, but mostly they come to reign, they come to administer. As you will find, we have very few examples of administrator Indologists. Number one, I want to mention the name of Hastings, who has done Gentoo law. He has a keen interest on Indian legal system, and he knew about Shariati laws, about uh, which was prevailing at that point of time. But at the same time, he took a particular interest in shaping the Hindu laws, which he has named as Gentoo laws. But I find that is an exception. And the second one is, obviously everybody he knows he is the father of Indology, now considered the father of Indology, William Jones. He was also an employee of East India Company. He was also an employee of East India Company, but he also kept apart his other roles. But he was a scholar, he was an enthusiast person, and he was a visionary. He was a visionary. If you can go through his deliverances which he gave in Asiatic Society. I can give you some examples. What was his idea about Indology, and when he founded Asiatic Society, what was his idea? Let me tell you. Let me tell you something about it. William Jones, in the first anniversary of Asiatic Society, it is, I'm quoting from him. He suggested to take an example for learned investigation, bounding them only by geographical take an ample space for learned investigation, bounding them only by geographical limits of Asia, considering Hindustan as a center, wanted to cultivate the treasures of Persia, Armenia, Turkey, and Arabia too. And emphasized that these languages should be learned apart from Farsi and Sanskrit. This was the limit and object of the society as depicted by him. William Jones, and I can tell you the name of another. I think he was not exactly the pioneer. Actually, as my base is basically history, I have found many documents where I find that the records have been kept not from the point of view of research on Indology, but that can be used as the source material of Indological studies. As I can mention there are many volumes of edifying and curious letters written by the Jesuit fathers. Obviously they wanted to explore the land and people. Just they had a motivation, they had some motive, they wanted to convert them, of course. But at the same time, the accounts they have kept, the observation they have made are and it is innumerable. They have written the letters to their headquarters, and from that we can get the sources of history. We can get the sources of history. I can tell you some of the interesting observations of these fathers. You know, Chandanagar was founded by the French officially just 10 years after the official foundation of Pondicherry. It was in 1674, and it was very much legalized, taking the permission of the emperor, of the local nababs, and everyone. But from the very beginning, Chandanagar, from 1696, the Augustinians of Hooghly, they used to control Chandanagar's religious scenario. Since 1734, it has come under the Jesuits, because there was a papal concord, when they can officially get a shift from the Augustinians of Hooghly. But the observations of the priest, I can mention you some, like like I can tell you about Pierre Martin. In a letter, he has written a letter in 1699, where he has told about the idol worshippers of Bangala. He has adopted basic Bangala from a famous university of Brahmin. This is the word he has quoted. I don't know which is the famous university of Brahmin. I think it is some toll situated in Navadvip or Nadia, because I am not that I am aware of any famous Brahmin university existing at that time in late 17th century. I don't know. From his letter, only we come to know that Company Royal of France got the permission to build from the local government to construct a parish in their newly acquired area. In another letter of 1709, Father Papa wrote about the technique of muslin weaving and the miserable condition of muslin weavers. So I think, though it is not from that exact pointer's viewpoint of Indology, we can always use these materials as our source material. He has also wrote about the ingredients of Ayurveda. In another volume, Father Tashar, he wrote from Chandanagar, the date is 1711. So they are much before the establishment of Asiatic Society. It was established in 1784. He writes, Father Tashar, he writes, if by God's grace I live long, I'll be able to send a vivid description of the richest and most affluent region of India. Father Barpier is suggesting to shift their center of commerce from Hooghly region, as it was the center of Mughal administration, and he suggested to go to Chattogram, because it was much more navigable and there was a specific distance from the capital. Here I would like to mention one thing. Though from 1704, Murshid Quli has shifted the Diwani from Dhaka to Murshidabad, till the Nababs and the successors and the successors of Aurangzeb, they were sitting in Dhaka. So Dhaka was still there, till then Dhaka was considered as as the capital. Anyway, so they wanted to have a difference. They have a geographical difference from Hooghly or Murshidabad, and uh, so that was one part. That was the part of the observations of the Jesuit missionaries. But apart from that, I want to mention the name of one particular father. He stands alone, and he is absolutely in the oblivion nowadays. His name was Father Charles de Montalembert. He came to Chandanagar in 1711, and he stayed here till 1728, when he was bound to leave the city because of his failing health. But I consider him to be the first Indologist in that sense, because he has kept a vivid description of the topography of the people, and he always tried to understand the sentiment of the people here. That was not because only because he wanted to convert them, because he wanted to understand them. That is an exception for which I find. And the director of the then French colony in Bangla, he depended much upon this person. So though he was officially a father, he was the de facto ruler of Chandanagar. He is the person who has founded a hospital in Chandanagar, where where people, irrespective of their caste, creed, and religion, had the right to get treated. He was the pathfinder in crusade against racism, and for all practical purposes, he disapproved the stringent Catholic rituals, Catholic marriage ceremonies, and suggested that to have a simpler way to make Christianity understood, understandable to the local people. He used to write constantly. He used to send reports to Pondicherry. With and in his letters, we find the vivid topographical, cultural, and human condition. The description of topography, culture, and human condition of this area, which reminds, as I have told you, this was the basic motto of William Jones. So, apart from these fathers, I can tell you about Onketil Duperhome, but I think that will come later.
It is so interesting that you mentioned Dipperon, because there is this clash of archives, if I could call it, not clash of civilizations, but clash of archives, because there was this running battle between these two Orientalists about who would lay claim to a certain archive, Indian archive especially. It was seen as a Zoroastrian archive, but then again, it was seen as Indian. So, claiming India. This is also the name of a very interesting book on French Indology, French colonialism, and Orientalism. But the thing is, I wanted to really know, because you expanded so wonderfully on the use of correspondence, personal
Yes.
memoirs, as a part of reconstruction of period history. In the case of Chandanagar, uh, do you feel, from your experience of working with those archives and delving into those archives, that there is a case to be made for two kinds of colonialism, the Francophone example and the Anglophone one? Whereas the Francophone, given your experiences of Chandanagar, you must have seen, I mean, and all the other trading posts in India, was that France's colonial approach, has been to christen everything as French, part of a bigger, wider, or maybe even a petite France, small France, delegating citizenship, that you all become a part of a larger French empire. Whereas the British were kind of built upon difference. They never wanted Indians to be like them, although they gave us the English language and all the other paraphernalia, the cultural paraphernalia that came with it. They never really wanted us to be British subjects, subjects of the UK. So, the color divide, the language divide, the cultural divide, they wanted that. Instead of the French, who wanted a more homogeneous, an embracing, that, you learn French language, you become a part of a larger French culture. So, there's a very distinct difference between Francophone colonialism, saying that someone who is born maybe in an Algeria, or Tunisia, or some other place, has the power to become a French citizen. He has that right. Whereas in India, I mean, we know that the British wanted themselves to be very exclusive, and although, as I said, they gave us the English language, but they wanted the association to be one of difference. So, did your work with Chandanagar reveal this idea of the French involvement, the kind of French involvement in Indian cultural life, in Indian spiritual life, in Indian the daily minutiae of Indians, the way in which they wanted to be involved? I mean, you mentioned the missionary who wrote and whom you considered as perhaps a father of French Indology, almost. Would you classify French Orientalism and Orientalist practice or ontological practices as something much more involved in Indian culture than the British example? Of we'll come to the Jones debate maybe later.
Actually, Chandanagar was too smaller place to get this sort of exposure. And basically, though Pondicherry was the administrative capital of French India, Chandanagar at one point of time, it was the final. It's something like Delhi and Mumbai, because Chandanagar during the early period of during the first half of 18th century, Chandanagar was the main source of income for the French company, for the royal treasury. At that time, it was a royal treasury because the royalty had a lot of involvement. Unlike the Britishers, in French case, the royalty had a lot of 45% of the company des Indes Oriental was owned by the royalty. So it was much controlled by the royalty, and their main source of income came from Chandanagar, not from Pondicherry. In the first half of 17th century, until 18th century, until the fall of Chandanagar and until the Battle of Plassey. After that, obviously, the scenario has changed. But at that point of time, my observation, I have made some observation which are very specific. I can tell you that in that sense, I don't find, except Anquetil Perron was an Indologist who was really thinking of India in a greater sense. But those who were appointed or who came, and at one point of time, of course, he came to Chandanagar when he came to Chandanagar in a very crucial moment when Chandanagar has fallen under the hand of the Britishers, and he wanted to go to Varanasi to learn Sanskrit, but he couldn't. And finally, he was treated as a war prisoner in Portsmouth. And when released, he had a debate with Oxford Pandits about the antiquity of Zendavesta and other Indian scripture. So, and then he went to France. But apart from him, I really don't find any other names apart from the priests. I really don't find any other names who were really interested in Indian civilization or culture. And you will be surprised to know that if you go through the basic registers, you will find that it is almost the same case like the Islamic conversion. I find very few so-called upper caste people were converted into Christianity, and except a very famous diwan or courtier of duplex, Indranarayan Chaudhary, he was a Brahmin. Otherwise, I really don't find any other so-called upper caste name who were who were in constant connection with the French people. I think the Hindu society resented a lot the colonial approach, and they didn't want to give any entry to the sahibs in that sense. It is my impression. So Indology, in that sense, I really don't think the seeds were sown in Chandanagar. Rather, by the idea of Anquetil Duperron, who was a real scholar and who really was the founder of Indology, in my opinion. Following his idea, 100 years after 100 years, L'École Française d'Extrême-Orient was founded in Pondicherry. L'Institut Français was founded in Pondicherry. But in Chandanagar, though there was an institute, a French institute, there is a French, it is not comparable with the research institutes that were founded by the French in Pondicherry. So if you want to specify it, which we call surplus on that place, the place didn't ignite this feeling. In my opinion, the place didn't ignite this feeling. The scholars who wanted to carry on their researches, they have done it from outside, and maybe some of them have passed through Chandanagar, but it never came up as the center of culture or something like that. So that is my impression. And the Indological, inquiries, always it was done either in Pondicherry or in Paris. And from the administrative class or from the people who were directly involved in business, they really didn't have much, not even duplex. If you go through his letters, you will find that he has come here to develop the trade. Though he had many Indian counterparts, here it was Indranaran Chaudhuri, and then in Pondicherry, he had another very famous courtier, but he was least bothered. He didn't take any initiative to dig into the glorious past of India. He didn't have that interest, and he is the most flamboyant and most famous person of Chandanagar's French history. And even for others, except in 18th century, in 19th century, I find two administrators, Joseph Cordier and Achille Bédier. They took some interest about the statistics, about the population, about their culture, but otherwise, I really don't find many names who took any initiative in Indological exposures.
Right. On Kanchanadi, it's very interesting that you mention Joseph Dupleix. Um, and you said that this entire interest was more of a trade interest, and
Yes.
culture was secondary, maybe even tertiary at that point in time. Uh, do you then consider that a true study of French Indology should expand the corpus of works that are studied to include literary works, because there is always this historical bias against the literary, that, well, it is all empire of the mind kind of, with not very much of archival actual hard research to go on with it. So you can create Indias sitting in your drawing room,
Yeah.
in France, in Paris. Why do you need to travel? So, whatever exotic thing comes to your mind, you can put it in your story. Now, that
Hmm.
being the idea, but I think, given the French manner of approach in India, I think this litany of regret. You talk about the 19th century. It started. The more powerful the British Empire became, the more this sense of regret of an opportunity lost, perhaps, and the crucial years of the late 18th and early 19th century up to 1814, around the heydays of Pondicherry we're talking about. So the regret gets more and more stronger and crystallizes as more as literature, as narratives. Probably there is a case to be argued in favor of an expansion of the body of works that are studied as part of Indology, not hardcore study of languages or recounting of local histories, but also perhaps including some literary works written at that time, both in France and by French delegates in India, perhaps, because that gives you a better sense of this sense that I'm talking about, this sense of regret developing, and this need of playing catch up with history in a way through literature. I mean, of course, the only place which can afford you this chance of catching up, perhaps, is literature, is the world of the imagination, because no other place will allow you to do that, because these are hard facts. Things have already happened, they are cast in iron. I wanted to ask you, especially about this idea about the if I could call it that, of course, the epistemological occupation of India, which the British had done. It's a kind of an epistemological occupation of India. So India had to be occupied, if not bodily, then at least by ideas. This occupation of India. Uh, we were talking, exchanging emails over the internet, and You're talking about the role of someone like Jean Philizat or Jean Deloche. You wanted to talk about them a little bit, especially Philizat and his preoccupation with medical texts, and his translations of our ancient Indian medical texts, and the way he worked, came to India, I think, just after independence for the first time in 1945, 47, 48, some around that time for the first time. And then several times he came to India and curated shows and exhibitions and lectures and everything else. You wanted to talk about the impact and role of these two central French figures in the, you might say, the history of Indology, and French Indology, that is to say. If you could say a few words about that.
Actually, what I find, the immunological studies are much nowadays. It has become much more specific. Obviously, the Filiosa, the family, the entire family of Filiosa, they're the pioneer in this case, because not only Jean Filiosa, his son Pierre Sylvain Filiosa, he is also very famous in, and he does. He is still he is around 92, 93, I suppose, but he is very active and he is still doing his research works on India. And his wife, Vasundhara Filiosa, she has done a fabulous work. She has compiled, of course, it was compiled, there is a compilation of manuscripts, 5 to 6 manuscripts on Vijayanagar, the last Hindu kingdom of Vijayanagar. There was a compilation of 5 to 6 manuscripts which went from Lisbon to the royal, at the time it was a royal library of France. And it is compiled together. There is the account of Vijayanagar by Fernão Nunes, Domingo Pais, Abdul Razak, Nikitin. Madame Filiosa, she has done the translation of that text in English, and moreover, she is a specialist of reading of our copper plates, ancient copper plates. So this tradition is going on, and for Jean Deloche, unfortunately, we Indians are not aware of his contribution in Indian in the field of Indology. He has authored 51 volumes of books on different subjects on India, and it is so varied. Unfortunately, we lost him year before last in 2019 November. He passed away in Pondicherry. Also, he has stayed throughout his life. He has stayed in Pondicherry, and he has authored 51 volumes of books. All of them are published from the School of Extreme Orient of Pondicherry or Paris, and his ideas are so varied. It is from the fort construction, it varies from fort construction of Jinji to the statistics of Chandanagar to the boat replica in terracotta temples of Bengal, from the account of Jean-Baptiste Chevalier, who tried to resume the French, not supremacy, French existence after Plassey in Bengal, and the account of Count of Modav. It is so varied, and all of them are concerning. I think that is a second wave of indological researches which started with these two persons, and it is still being continued. But what I find that nowadays it is more concentrated, as everywhere it is happening, more concentrated on trade, on industry, rather than ancient scripture or religion. So that is the difference between, but it is still continuing, and it is very specific and it is very profound. So there is a hope, I think. And one thing we should discuss about the contribution of Anquetil Duperron. He also came as the employee of the royal company, because at that time everything was royal. He came, but he was neither an administrator nor a tradesman. He is the first official employee of the French king, who came here to decipher the texts in Farsi and Sanskrit. he was specifically employed for that. So this is the difference. He came for his Indological research, for his Indological researches, which has been backed by the royalty. And if we go through his life, he has traveled a lot, because he used to believe that you will have to be in a place to understand it, to understand its culture, its civilization, its people. So that was number one. And number two was his approach. His approach was very scientific. His approach was very specific, very scientific, without any emotion. As we have already said, there is a lot of imagination in cultivating Indology. But if you see Oketil Duperno's writing, it is so specific, it's almost like a scientific research, in my opinion. And after that, he has given his documents to the Royal Treasury. At that time, it was Royal Treasury, sorry, not Treasury, Royal Library. And after the revolution, it has become the Public Library of France. But at the same time, he by heart, he was so influenced by Indian culture, that when Napoleon asked for the fidelity, he asked for the announcement of fidelity to the country, to the nation. Then he declined to do that. He left his job, saying that I can only declare that to God, none else. And then he made himself secluded. Absolutely, he led an absolute secluded life till 1805, and he was very much influenced by the Indian yogis. He used to eat once a day. He used to sleep in the on the ground, because he was so terrified by the terrors of the revolution. He he just wanted to make himself completely secluded from India, like our yogis who goes for prior probation, something like that. So Ankitil Duperha, I think he should be more studied. Now the study has begun with Sanjay Subramaniam and others. They're doing fabulous work on him. But even in today's research, I find now the studies are more concentrated on people. Previously, people were completely neglected. Now I find they are much more, they're now concentrated on people. With the, maybe it is a collaborator, it is about the collaborators, or it is about the middlemen. But previously, Indian population never got any importance in any French research, which I found, except in the statistics. But now they are trying to understand Indian society. The new generation Indologists like Rafael Malagna or Julie Marquet, they're working on India, but they're trying to understand the people. So this is the difference I can tell you through three generations, which is going on in French Indological researches.
Kanchanadi, I return to what I started with. In the light of your study of French preoccupation with Indian culture and history, uh, how do you see this Bonjour India initiative? Because you're in a very interesting position, in being the president of Alliance Française, a kind of you are aware of policy, French policy. I mentioned cultural diplomacy. How far do you think the line of succession of ideas, you might say, does it reach out and come and hit us in the present? I mean, how is French cultural policy in the modern times, in the modern era, in our times, dictated by those colonial preoccupations or the axioms that we were talking about? The characteristics that we were talking about. How much do you think they affect French cultural policy today?
Actually, now India is playing, frankly speaking, is playing a very important role in French diplomacy in all senses, not only cultural, but in French diplomacy. India has gained its position. India has gained its position. So, from that point of view, I think now France is trying to uh, show us the best of France like we are getting the cultural programs which are really very contemporary, very modern. And previously what we used to get, we used to get the programs which have been done, maybe like the last one I remember, though he was contemporary, like Marcel Marceau. Marcel Marceau came to India, but that was at the time at even Kolkata, and he performed. And he performed. Fortunately, we had the chance to see Marcel Marceau performing in Rabindranath, but that was a rare occasion. That, but now what I find, that the programs which are coming from different parts of France. First of all, it was initially Paris oriented. That idea has changed. From different parts of France, the cultural programs which are coming are trying to touch India's mass, which is very, which I appreciate a lot, because literature is not, very well, to tell you very frankly, literature is not for all. But if you bring something audiovisual or performance based, it is more appealing to usual masses. Just like that, I remember we had one singer called Manu Chao. He's a very famous singer of France. And in Princep Ghat, we had a program with him. It was a fabulous success. So, this music, circus, other parents of different personalities, these things are much more appealing to normal people. And I find, I would like to tell you another thing, in reaction to, not in reaction, in exchange to Bonjour India, we are also having a program in France every, obviously now everything has been dislocated, but there was a cultural program going on in France called Namaste France. There we were showcasing our cultural events, our cultural performances. So that was an inter-exchange between France and India. And now what I find, they are trying to send some of their scientific programs, which was very rare. Previously, it was never done. I can tell you, this year we are going to have in Kolkata. We are going to have a photographic exhibition, and another scientific exhibition, which is, previously we never had this sort of things. Now we are going to have it. So the story is changing, and it is more contemporary France which they are trying to showcase, which I appreciate a lot. Because what is the use of knowing France of Jules Verne? Of course, knowing is good, but we should not be confined in that period. We should know what the contemporary things are going on. So from that point of view, I find it very contemporary and very modern, what they are trying to showcase now.
Thank you, Kanchanadi, for enlightening and expanding on that. So basically, the new connections between France and India talk about or pick up on the breaking of binaries. France, India, Britain, India, to a kind of a France, Britain, India, a kind of a more of a open confederacy of ideas. You might say a web of connections, if I could call it. And you talk about popular culture, contemporary culture being the grist for this kind of an
Yes.
exchange, for this kind of a thing to
Yes.
take off, both ways. It has been a fabulous opportunity to talk to you about these subjects and to gather your opinions on these matters. As Marco Polo, I think, wrote it somewhere that if I wrote all the stories, if I wrote everything that I saw, no one would believe me. So, early histories were about writing. I mean, Duperon basically was writing everything that he saw, kind of. But there is also a quote from Aimé Césaire, which says that historians are the novelists of civilization. Uh, we have been privileged today to listen to one of the novelists of civilization, novelists of exchange between two extremely rich cultures, that of France, that of India. Kanchanadi, we have been privileged to have this talk with you. Uh, Thank you so much for being here, giving a valuable time to us and talking. And also thank you, Alliance Francaise for supporting our virtual conference.
On the contrary, Devashish, I would like to thank you and the University of Shimla, the Himachal, which has given me you have given me the chance to talk about these things, which are less known, less propagated. So I consider it to be a chance to be a part of this erudite conference. Thank you so much for offering me the chance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanchanadi. Thank you so much. Do stay well.